We'll go ahead and begin tonight. Thank you all for being here. It's the strong of will and the strong of heart that keeps getting you out during these dark winter months, and I appreciate it dramatically. Tonight the topic is the wandering Jew, because tonight is all about how the Jewish world shifted through the Middle Ages from its life in exile in Persia or Babylonia, all the way moving westward in good Horace Greeley fashion to ultimately Spain, to another exile on the other end. And so it's an interesting period of time as we watch the Jewish community move in stages. It reminds me often of the movement of Abraham, stage by stage, place by place as he moved from up in the north, Assyria, that part of the world, all the way south into Egypt, back into Canaan, and ultimately settled near, as we know, Rishon. So last week we kind of stopped at this period of time of the intertestamental period, the 150, 200 years before the birth of Islam. And so we're in Persia, Babylonia. We had been in Babylonia for 1,000 years. So the period of time that we would call the Babylonian period is not just the 70 years of exile from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus. It really exists far beyond the exile of Nebuchadnezzar for 1,000 years into the future. So we're in the 6th century of the Common Era. The exile was in the 6th century before the Common Era. And we're living pretty high on the hog in Persia. All right? And what's remarkable about life in Persia in the 6th century is that the Persian Jews, those Jews living in Surah and Pumbedita, had established whole societies. And they had elected someone who was called the Reish Galut. Now, those who know a little, that's Aramaic, but the Hebrew is very similar. Rosh Galut. So what's Rosh? Head. Galut, the diaspora. So this person was the chief of the diaspora. And he had to be from the line of King David. In order to be elected Reish Galuta, you had to be from the Davidic line. It was almost as if the Jewish community in Babylonia, Persia, was really toying with the idea of messianism by elevating to their leadership someone who somehow, through some sense of genealogy, could trace their lineage back to David. The leader of each of the academies, so Surah and Pumbedita were like, they were academies, they were institutions of learning. And the leader of each of them was called a Gaon. Now, what does the word Gaon mean? It means luminary. So they weren't called rabbis. They were the gaon of the academy, the luminary, something even greater than the everyday average learner. And the gaonim were really important forces in establishing what we call today tefillah. Everything we know as to the order of a worship service comes from the gaonim. So our worship service, the order, was determined by the gaonim in Surah and Pumbedita and carried throughout time to today. Unchanged, really. The gaonim were the first ones to develop the order of worship. And for those who are familiar with the silent prayer, the language of that silent prayer was the language that the Gaon, Sadia Gaon, wrote as his language. Because someone asked him, Sadia, when we get to the silent prayer, what do you say? And he says, Dear God, keep my lips from speaking guile. And it's a famous phrase, which is a part of our silent prayer. This was a very creative period, a period of great expression, and the Jews were fairly autonomous in Persia. But as we know, that's not going to last very long. And in 618, a guy named 613, a guy named Muhammad entered the world. And Muhammad he began by thinking that he could bring monotheism to the Arabs. So before 613, all the Arab tribal systems toyed with different forms of polytheism. So there were different gods for different places and times and dates, and they were essentially a group of nomadic tribes that didn't have a basis of faith that united them. And Muhammad thought, Muhammad thought that he could unite them all by establishing monotheism. And he realized that of all the monotheists, Judaism was the closest to Islam, to the Arabs. By practice and by idea. He did not like the ideas present in Christianity because of the Trinity. He didn't believe that it was pure monotheism. And so he patterned Islam on Judaism and thought that he could use his new form of monotheism to entice Jews to leave Judaism and join this new faith of Islam. Guess what? It didn't work. It not only didn't work, when it didn't work, he got angry. And he got angry at the Jews for not following the path that he had set. And so in 711, actually before 711, back in the 600s, Muhammad decided, fine, I'm leading a campaign, and the Arabs conquered Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem had passed from Rome, from Babylonia, through to Rome, well, through the Greeks to Rome, and now through Rome, it had now passed briefly back to some kind of Jewish hegemony, but then ultimately Arabs were in control. So Arabs invaded the land of Israel, taking control from the remnants of the Roman Empire. The Holy Land became under a long period of Arab rule, lasting really until the time of the Crusaders. And one of the big challenges in this period of time had to do with these people, the Karaites. So what do you know about the Karaites? You've heard the term, I hope?
These are people that only believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible without rabbinic interpretation.
Okay, very good. It comes from the word kara. Kara in Hebrew is the root ligro, or to read. So they only believed in the written Torah, not the oral Torah. Well, as we know, everything that goes back here all the way to 586 BCE has suddenly become heavily weighted by the oral Torah. And so the Karaites were really coming out of a strange place 1,100 years, or not 1,100, 700 years later. But they, in essence, rejected the work of the rabbis, of the academies, of the Geonim, of everyone that existed before them, and they started a schism in the Jewish world. Here's an interesting fun fact. Who knows what cholent is? Okay. What's cholent? Make it for Shabbat. It's a stew. Did you know that cholent was a Karaite invention? Okay? So cholent is a protest food. All right? The purpose of having a stew, as mentioned by the scholars in the 10th century, to underscore and emphasize our belief in the oral tradition of the Mishnah and Talmud. The oral law explains, right? This is the difference. An oral law explains that a Jew is permitted to have a fire burning in the house as long as you lit it before Shabbat began. Karaites, on the other hand, maintain that the prohibition against fire was total. That you couldn't leave a fire burning, and you couldn't have a fire burning, because on Shabbat there should be no fire burning. Therefore, Karaites sat in the dark, ate cold food, froze in the winter.
And they didn't have Shabbat elevators.
No Shabbat elevators. So hot food on Shabbat became the protest against the Karaites. And therefore, if you ate cholent, you were not a Karaite. And if you sat in the dark, then you were a Karaite. Jewish scholarship did not really fall victim to the Karaites. They were a small sect of people, and there are probably still one or two of them alive today. I certainly know people like that.
Maybe Turkey, maybe?
Huh?
Maybe some Turkey.
Well, I'm thinking in Ridgefield. I mean, I think there are people who still struggle with the idea of the oral law. Right? Keep in mind that as late as the end of the 19th century, the Ethiopian Jews were Karaites. They didn't know from the oral Torah. When Solomon Schechter discovered them in 1899 in Ethiopia, they had never heard of the Talmud. They didn't even know that the temple did not exist, and they were still doing sacrifices in Ethiopia following the tradition of the temple. And so that's, we're almost at the 20th century, and here they are. And so when they were discovered, and he brought to them the Talmud as kind of a gift to the Karaites, they burned it because it made no sense to them, because they were still living in a biblical world. So there's a legend here, and this is a really important legend. There's a legend from the Middle Ages that there were 4 rabbis from Babylonia who were captured by pirates on the Mediterranean Sea. And the pirates took them and ransomed them off to Jewish communities who were willing to pay great sums of money for the rabbis to free them from captivity. So one rabbi, Shemaria ben Elchanan, was taken to Alexandria in Egypt. One, Hushiel ben Chiron, to Morocco. And to Morocco and Tunisia. Moses ben Hamach to Spain and Cordoba. And another, Natan ben Isaac HaKohen, to Narbonne in France. In one fell swoop, these pirates totally dispersed Jewish wisdom throughout the Mediterranean coast, decentralizing it from the Gaonim, keeping it away from Jerusalem, and sending it to the coastal areas around the Mediterranean.
This is true. This is.
Well, it's a legend. I don't know. Nobody knows the validity of it or who they were or anything.
These
But
people live? Is this?
we don't know. We don't know.
Okay, we just don't know.
But what we do know is that if something happened to disperse Jewish knowledge, and that dispersion of Jewish knowledge led to the next stage of Jewish connectiveness, and that is the expansion of the Jews throughout the Muslim world. So far, we've gotten somewhere in here. We've put a harem on the Karaites. We've exiled them. The people over here, the Reish Galuta and Gaonim, who have lived, through the 9th century, are going to begin to fade into the woodwork. And what happens next is a period of rabbinic creativity. One would call that golden age, right? And the key to that golden age comes down to a guy. You may have heard his name, Saladin. Who is Saladin?
He was a sultan.
Okay. He was a sultan. Okay.
He captured Jerusalem.
Captured Jerusalem.
And he let the Christians get out.
Okay.
Whereas when the Christians captured Jerusalem, they wiped everybody out.
Okay. What else do we know of Saladin?
He was a very cruel ruler.
Okay. I'm gonna challenge you on that. Saladin had a doctor. And his doctor, living in Alexandria, Egypt at the time, was a man named Maimonides. And Maimonides, according to Jewish tradition, when Saladin took Jerusalem from the Crusaders, he allowed Jews to move back in. Now, Saladin was certainly into extending his reign and rule, but because of his friendship with Maimonides, there are those who would say that really began what was ultimately going to become the Golden Age. Now, some things happened before then, and we'll talk about that. So, as has been the case so far in human history, Jews are once again caught between two forces. From the west, we have Christianity moving east into Jerusalem, into the Middle East, trying to solidify its hold. From the east, we have Islam. And we're here in the middle, constantly, between opposing forces. When the places we lived were controlled by the Muslims, Jews felt reasonably comfortable. When the places we lived were controlled by Christians, Jews did not feel reasonably comfortable. Now that would change after the Middle Ages, but really, Jews under Muslim rule were comfortable until the middle of the 19th century and the rise of Zionism. Now, we might say, what does it mean to be comfortable when you're living under someone else's rule? But we had a different kind of understanding of partnership in Muslim-controlled countries versus Christian-controlled countries. So we're going to go through a little bit of the Crusades. I'm going to mention a few people along the way, and we'll see where it takes us. So we're going to start in Morocco. If indeed that fable is somewhat true. So one rabbi went to Morocco or Tunisia, one went to France, one went to Spain, and one went to Greece, or Alexandria, Egypt. So if that story is true, we'll start in Morocco. And there was a guy there in 1013 whose name was Rabbi Isaac Al-Fassi. Al-Fassi means from Fez. So it was Rabbi Isaac from Fez. Now Rabbi Isaac from Fez was not a Karaite. He was a big proponent of oral law and rabbinic interpretation, and the idea that the process that began in the Talmudic period should continue. And he was a very prolific responder to questions that people asked. So it was his idea that people needed a Cliff Notes of Jewish law. So the Talmud is 26 volumes, huge amount of text, written in Aramaic that by this time nobody read anymore. It was a struggle for people to read it. And so he had it in his mind that he would create a text, a Cliff Notes version of Jewish law that allowed people to find the answer really quickly. And he wrote it, and it became well known. There was some criticism of him that he took out all the debate, the dialogue, and people were, he was just interested in what's the question and what's the answer. But, that text became known as the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, or the short form of the ordered table. Shulchan Aruch, ordered table, Kitzur means short. So, he took Jewish law to its next step, part of this golden age. In France, even more happened. In 1040, a guy named Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchaki, or Rashi, was born. Who is Rashi? Everybody knows who Rashi is. We've heard the name. Rashi is the most prolific commentator on Jewish text ever. So he wrote the definitive commentary on every single book of the Bible. He wrote a commentary on the entire order of the Mishnah and all 63 sections of the Talmud. In addition to writing a commentary on 2/3 of the corpus of all rabbinic midrash in the 11th century. In addition to all of that, he wrote a responsa and a prayer book, and he operated a vineyard, which is where he earned his money.
He operated what?
A vineyard. He was a winemaker. He did all of his writing without assistance, everything written by his hand. He invented his own script to make it easier on himself. It's made it harder on everyone else in the Jewish world, but it made it easier on himself to write using his own script. And so everything that is in Rashi, or done by Rashi, today is printed in Rashi's script.
But what language did he work in?
So, we believe that Rashi worked in Hebrew, primarily. He lived in France. We don't believe, some of the people, like Maimonides and Halevi, worked primarily in Arabic. But Rashi, we believe, worked solely in Hebrew. Because that was the language of the works that he was trying to reinterpret.
Does Hebrew have a scripting language?
Well, Hebrew has a script, but the Hebrew script has absolutely no relationship to Rashi's script. So every letter looks different. Almost every letter.
Was Rashi trying to do a form of shorthand? Is that what this?
Well, some would say he was probably writing it that way because it was easier for him. It's not shorter, because for every letter there's a letter. It's just maybe it flowed that way better for him. It was not a popular way. People didn't write in a script. There are no other commentaries printed in script other than Rashi. Now, You might say that's to highlight Rashi's brilliance, because he was able to do this, and so therefore we should mark his gifts as different than everything else. But I believe that, of all, if there was ever a person to whom you wanted to follow a commentary, Rashi is one of them. Although I happen to like the commentaries of Nachmanides more, because it's more in keeping with my path. So Rashi is held in such high esteem that the Code of Jewish Law, the book that's called the Code of Jewish Law, actually directs Jews today to review the weekly portion every week together with Rashi's commentary. That you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of reading Torah unless you read it together with Rashi's commentary. So Rashi brought an erudition to the Jewish world also during this period. Someone else who followed Rashi, Abraham ibn Ezra, another commentator. So in this period of the 11th century, we have Fasten, we have Rashi, we have Ibn Ezra. We're going to move into Maimonides and Nachmanides and Gersonides, all in the next. So this is a hugely creative period of time where all of these commentaries were written that are still a part of the corpus of Jewish study today.
Was there relatively peaceful time for the Jews when they were writing?
So this is what the period of time we would call the Golden Age of Spain. So these are all people, France, North Africa, and Alexandria, that are under Muslim rule, where the Jews are virtually free to live our lives. And many of these figures spent their life creating Judaism. It's only after the Christians came back through and said, we want that land. And Christianity and Islam went head to head. That under Christian rule, Jews were not treated the same.
I noticed that France was under Muslim, and Spain was under Muslim.
Can you put a time period on the Golden Age?
Well, if so, I'm going to be a little bit more large in my view, but I would say the Golden Age of Spain, or what's called the Golden Age, really exists from 711, that time when 90% of the Jews in the world were living under Muslim rule, beginning in 711. 90%. And it ends, probably with the first exile in 1290. When the Jews were kicked out of England. And it probably ended a little bit before that. So let's kind kind of moving around in circles. 1096. 1096 marks the beginning of the First Crusade. The first Crusaders were Christians who decided they wanted to take the land of Israel away from Muslims. So they marched on the Holy Land, if you will. So Godfrey de Bouillon, one of the leaders of the First Crusade, said, "We're going all the way to the Holy Land to rid it of infidels. What about the heretics among us?" And he was referring to the Jews that lived in Europe at that time. So the Crusades became a terrible ordeal for the Jews, and in the first months of the Crusade, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. In the Rhineland and in France, often the Crusaders at that point offered the Jews an option, convert to Christianity or die, and the vast majority of Jews chose death over abandonment of Judaism. In 1099, Jerusalem was conquered by the Crusaders, and all the Jews who had returned to Jerusalem and were living under Muslim rule in Jerusalem were put into a synagogue and burnt alive by the Crusaders. Around that period of time, so now we're at 1100 of the Common Era. Here is where our friend Saladin and Maimonides come in. So Saladin begins in Egypt, and he decides that he wants to conquer Jerusalem. And so he leads a counterattack against the Christians who had inhabited the Holy Land. And indeed, he defeated the First Crusaders. And one of the first things he did was allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And the story is told that it is because Maimonides was his friend and his physician. Let's see, there was something I wanted to share with you. So what do we know about Maimonides? So he lives from 1135 to 1204. Comparable in creativity to Rashi, probably the greater of the two. He wrote copious amounts of material. He wrote the entire code of Jewish law, and he created the Mishneh Torah, which was considered the second Torah. He wrote a very wonderful guide on Jewish philosophy called the Guide for the Perplexed. If you ever are looking for something to explore. The Guide for the Perplexed in English. There's actually a one-volume, very thin text written by a professor at the University of Chicago named Kenneth Seeskin, Seeskin, called The Guide for Today's Perplexed. And it's based on his understanding of Maimonides' guide. And it's a really good text for 21st century Jew in trying to comprehend Jewish philosophy. But Maimonides writes this letter. So this guy, Ibn Tibbon was a very wise contemporary of Maimonides, and they were known for their translating abilities. They translated a lot of Jewish writing from Arabic to Hebrew. But one of them wrote to Maimonides and said, I wanted to come visit you. Maimonides told him, look, I get up at dawn and pray. I then go to the court of the vizier of Egypt and attend to the psychological and physical needs of the court and the government until late afternoon. I then travel back to where I live. By the time I get home, I'm able to pray the afternoon service, quickly grab a bite to eat, and by that time there's a line of patients lined up outside my house waiting to be seen by me in the evening. I go through the patients, apologize to each one for their having to wait, do a little bit of triage to decide who are the most urgent cases. I then start seeing patients in my surgery. About close to midnight, I'm so exhausted I must lie down on the examination couch while my patients stand up. Then Maimonides would start working on his studying and writing of Torah. He also reported that on the Sabbath, his day is taken up with prayer, study of Torah, and people from Jewish communities all over the world who want to spend Shabbat with him in order to have time to consult with Maimonides about matters affecting the community. He writes to the translator, so my dear, I would love for you to come, but feel that I could not give you any time in which to discuss, and your trip would be for nothing. So he writes that saying, this is my life, this is what I do. And you think you're exhausted at the end of the day. Without a doubt, this was the most expressive time for Jews. Between Rashi and Maimonides, and a half a dozen people in between them, most of the commentary we use today to understand all Jewish text was created in the span of maybe 100, 150 years. So Maimonides is kind of the end of that golden age, and he dies in 1204. And as we know, at the golden age draws to an end, not because Islam changes its view of Jews, but because the Crusades catch their second and third wind, and the Crusaders come through, pushing Jews further and further, to the edge in Spain. And I want to stop here for a moment and see if we have some things we need to talk about, if I've glossed over something along the way.
Stuff about Mohammed, right? Mohammed wrote down his displeasure with the Jews at some point, or it was just an oral thing, or just an understood thing.
So,
and does that relate to today at all?
Right. So Muhammad never really writes down, I mean, in the Quran, there is no rejection of Judaism specifically at all.
Just the infidels.
There is more of a discomfort in the Quran with Christianity. Although there are chapters in the Quran for Jesus and Mary and some of the Christian figures. It was more of an unspoken or unwritten displeasure, a dissatisfaction. Did it impact beyond the conquering of Jerusalem? I don't think it did. And I think Islam softened, because I think Islam became welcoming to Judaism, because they realized we both drew our roots from Abraham. Today's displeasure with Judaism is political. It's not theological. There was no political displeasure because Israel was never in the position of being able to displace anybody from our land. We were simply at the whim of, Christianity, Islam. We didn't have our own sense of hegemony. And so we couldn't pose a threat.
You haven't mentioned anything about false messiahs. Were they a significant influence up until 1204?
Well, last week we talked a little bit about Bar Kokhba.
Yes.
And Bar Kokhba was a dismal failure as a hopeful messiah. And between Bar Kokhba and Shabbatai Tzvi, Shabbatai Tzvi is in the 17th century. There was not a lot of sense of fault. There were a couple of figures who claimed it for themselves, but there was never any corporate identity that this person might be it. Between Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century and Shabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century, it was very quiet. Now, what happens between the death of Maimonides and the exile or the expulsion from Spain is important. We'll get there in a moment.
Why were the Jews always at the whim? In the sense that, Jews were, well, I guess the basic claim, sort of they are first. And these other identities sort of grew up later. Was there something about the way the Jews practiced or believed, or that they didn't grow into a stronger power or numbers?
Right. So a lot of it has to do with dispersion. Remember that when Nebuchadnezzar took the Jews to Babylonia, 2/3 remained. 1/3 came back to Jerusalem. The Jews within the Holy Land were the smaller group. The Jews living in the diaspora were the larger group. That has held true even until today. There are more Jews in the Galut than there are in Israel. So the question is, why didn't all the Jews come back to Israel? And that's a theological question. And it had to do with the understanding of what Israel represented and the loss of Jewish self-control and self-determination. So it would have wreaked havoc on the Talmudic tradition and the Gaonic tradition, the tradition of response and modernity that most of the Jews in the diaspora wanted to live by.
But is there something different about religion? Because I think being dispersed could cut both ways. Being dispersed could be the introduction to spreading the religion throughout the world. And that didn't seem to happen, whereas, Islam grew to a significant force in just in numbers, Christianity, just pure numbers.
So because we never had our own country, from the time of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, we were always guests in someone else's country. And proselytization only works if you're in charge. Why does Christianity get its leg up? Because Rome declares it the state religion. And then if you want to live in Rome, you have to be Christian. And so when you're the guest, and the laws say you can't proselytize. So Judaism was a proselytizing religion when we were in our own land, in our own country, and we had our own law and ruler and everything. But as soon as we weren't, we weren't. And so we have maintained that. Even though today, one could make the case, we could do it again. We could be a proselytizing tradition once more.
While the Crusaders were attacking Jewish communities, etc., was there an official position of the church? Did the church know what was going on? Did they encourage it, discourage it, not be able to do anything about it?
I believe it was it was an embedded cultural identity in churches going back to the 4th century. From the 4th century of the Common Era on, church law forbid the interaction between Jews and Christians. It prevented in Christian communities Jews from owning land or farms or territories. I think it was the logical extension of laws that had been on the books for 600 or 700 years. I don't believe it was something new. Just because they were on a marauding act, or expansionist act. I think it was the logical extension of where the church had been for 600 years. If you look at the prohibitions or the edicts of Nazi Germany, they follow almost to the letter the same edicts from the 4th and 5th century that the church put out against the Jews. Raoul Hilberg wrote a wonderful history called The Destruction of the European Jews, where he traces church law and Nazi law. And almost law for law, it follows the path from the early stages of the Council of Nicaea on.
I would imagine it was also something of a surprise that Jews wouldn't convert, because as Christianity expanded, they were very successful at having heathens convert. They would just win the battle and go convert and die like
So what happens, especially in this kind of, we're in like the third crusade, is a curious thing. We begin what's called the period of disputations. And it became the kind of the game played by the church against the Jews.
What does that word mean?
A disputation is an argument where you dispute the validity of the other's philosophy. And so it was not uncommon in this period of time between the second or the third crusade, so we're in the 13th century after the death of Muhammad, and before the expulsion from England in 1290, where Jews were, a leading Jew in the community was brought before the king and told to debate in public a Christian scholar. And the debate was stacked up against the Jews. The rabbis were told, you can't say anything which we deem insulting to Christianity. You may not say anything which may appear to say that Christianity is false. You may not say anything which may appear to say that Jesus is not the Messiah. So imagine having to debate Christianity when you can't say it's false, Jesus isn't the Messiah. My little curriculum says it's like going up against Muhammad Ali with your hands tied behind your back. It's a little dated. Now I think we'd probably be okay. Nachmanides was ordered to debate Pablo Christiani. Pablo Christiani was a Jew who had converted to Christianity. And the Spaniards, the Spanish Christians had a great deal of respect for Nachmanides. And he refused to debate them. And he refused to debate him unless he had freedom of speech. And the Spanish prince agreed. And this debate took place in 1263. Nachmanides demolished his Christian opponent in the debate. He did so well that Christian authorities in Spain ordered that all Jews must listen to a Christian sermon the Sunday after the debate. Because all the Jews were walking around, way to go, Nachmanides! It was like a soccer match. The Jews are running through the streets with the big Jewish flag on their back. So in the great synagogue in Barcelona, the week after this disputation took place, a Christian stood up to give the sermon. But then Nachmanides stood up after them and refuted every point in the speech. And as a reward for what he did, the king gave Nachmanides a whole lot of money. And he said, I've never heard anyone defend so brilliantly something so wrong. You can never win. And Nachmanides then published a transcript of the disputation. His victory was so overwhelming that Nachmanides was expelled from Spain. So following that expulsion, Nachmanides goes to Israel and establishes a Jewish community in Jerusalem. And he took one of the abandoned houses and built a synagogue there that became known as Beit Knesset HaRambam, the Nachmanides synagogue. And if you go to the old city of Jerusalem, the Nachmanides synagogue is in the old city, in the Jewish quarter. It was the tallest building in the old city prior to 1948. And on the beginning of the war in 1948, the Arab Legion blew it up. Because there was a principle in Muslim-controlled areas that no building could be taller than the minaret of the mosque. And Beit Rambam was taller than that building. So there was this idea of disputation took off through Europe, and every king would stand up some Jew to debate some Christian on the efficacy of Judaism versus Christianity. And most of the time, the Jews were, the cards were stacked so heavily against us that we may have won the argument, but we lost the war, or lost the battle. And what led to ultimately in 1290 the expulsion of the Jews from England.
That was the first expulsion? I thought England was one of the last.
No. 1290 was England. Around 1350 was France. And then 1492 was Spain. So also during this period, creativity didn't cease. There was the beginnings of Jewish mysticism to emerge through a text called the Zohar, which means brilliance. The Zohar is attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, but not revealed to the world until Shimon Bar Yochai is 2nd century, but it wasn't revealed to the world until a guy named Moshe de Leon did that in 1290. Now where it was for 1,000 years, we don't know. Maybe in Moshe de Leon's mind. But the Kabbalists brought a whole new dimension to Jewish creativity that's going to really carry us after the expulsion. So,
Rabbi,
yeah.
could you, I think I missed something. Can you go back to the reason for the expulsion from England?
So, in 1189 is when the Third Crusade begins. King Richard I, Richard the Lion-Hearted, Robin Hood guy, led a full-fledged massacre of the Jews in England. Most people weren't even aware there were Jews in England at the time, but they found the ones they could and they destroyed them. In 1215 of the Common Era, Jews were forced to wear a badge, the first star. And it was called the Badge of Shame. It was imposed by the Fourth Lateran Council, Council of Church Leaders. The badge, we know, was the same badge that the Nazis forced the Jews to wear in World War II. So in 1290, on what day? The 9th of Av, okay, Tisha B'Av, remember last week. First temple, 9th of Av. Second temple, 9th of Av. You know, the expulsion, the expulsion from England, 9th of Av. Expulsion from Spain also, the 9th of Av. Yes?
Yes, my understanding, I'm looking for your verifier, understanding this right, that you had one sea captain drowned Jews at sea, you know, with a low tide on the way out from England. When he came back, the king had an egg. I was wondering if that jives with what you...
I don't know that story. I don't know that. So, this is what I would suggest. So, King Edward I in 1290 expels the Jews from England. So many believe that the expulsion was due to the fact that many Englishmen had borrowed money from Jews and didn't want to have to repay the debt. So in an effort to get rid of the Jews, riots were started and the Jews were expelled. Approximately 44,000 Jews then fled to France from England. Officially, no Jews were allowed to enter England from 1290 to 1650s, which means that when Shakespeare was around, there was not a Jew in England to serve as a model for Shylock. But evidently, anti-Semitic stereotypes may have been so ingrained that the negative vision of Jews prevailed in their absence. In 1348, other history dates, Black Plague, the Jews are blamed for bringing the Black Plague to Europe. Now, the Black Plague killed scores of Jews, but it doesn't matter. We were still blamed for it, even though the Pope at the time issued a papal bull saying the Jews weren't responsible for this, but nobody listened to it. So in Spain, as we know, the church had begun a campaign against heretics of the Catholic faith. This included Jews who had converted to Christianity, but who the Christians believed weren't loyal to their decision. So at the end of the 14th century, the Catholic Church, Spanish Catholics, became progressively violent against Jews. And we began the kind of this sense of torture and terrible, images that we know from Tomás de Torquemada. He was a priest and Queen Isabella's confessor, and he convinced the Pope to establish an inquisitorial tribunal, a papal court, to investigate charges of heresy, to find converts who were returning to their own faith, and it was cruel. Every suspicion that could be leveled was leveled. The horrors of the Inquisition were only followed by the decree by Ferdinand and Isabella that those who remained in Spain would convert to Catholicism or die. Conversos who remained in Spain, they felt might be less tempted to return to Jerusalem, to Judaism, if all the other Jews were killed or exiled. So the expulsion occurred in 1492. Lots of discussion about whether or not Christopher Columbus was Jewish, since the ship that he sailed on left port on the 9th of Av in 1492.
And some of his crew, I think, were alleged to be.
Right. There has been a whole lot of ink spent on trying to prove that Columbus was Jewish, and that the leading sailors on his ship were Jewish, and that he carried off some Jews as passengers because of the expulsion. And one of his interpreter, Luis de Torres, was Jewish, and was supposedly the first European to settle in the New World, was a Jew.
Now, what point did the name Christopher not become used by Jews? I would assume forever.
Right. So there's a whole lot of discussion as to whether or not he was a converso or his parents were conversos, and that in some way he was a friend of Ferdinand and Isabella, and they informed him of this plan so that he was on the ship itself in the harbor and off Spanish soil before the expulsion took place. So historians keep trying to prove this. There's absolutely no real evidence. There's a whole lot of circumstantial evidence, but it's hard to say. Now, the Inquisition did not end with the expulsion. And in fact, until the 19th century, in Spain, heretics and Marranos were still being discovered. We don't like to use the term Marrano. We use the term converso. Marrano is a derogatory word that means pig. Converso is someone who is forcibly converted. And there were over 2,000 public hearings and autos de fe, which were public burnings of Jews. And the last auto de fe was conducted in 1790. All right? Nearly 40,000 Jews lost their lives in Spain alone.
Did the Inquisition also go after gays? Or was it just...
There were also inquisitions in Portugal, in Italy, Sicily, Padua, and other places where the Catholic Church held great power. It even reached as far as South America. Now we know that many of the Jews who arrived in North America came from the West Indies and Brazil. In order to escape the Inquisition, they fled to South America and the West Indies, which had the earliest Jewish settlements were, we know, in Rhode Island, Newport, in South Carolina, in New York, and in Pennsylvania. But we kind of begin this period of time with a chosen exile. Life is good in Sura and Mumbadita. And we end this period with a forced exile. Technically, the country of Spain did not remove the exile of Jews from Spain until 1992. on the 500th anniversary of the exile, there was a public kind of ceremony removing the expulsion of Jews from Spain. My wife, whose family was from Spain, suddenly found out Jews who have traced their lineage to Spain can reclaim dual citizenship in Spain.
She told me that.
Yeah. So she's all over it. She's going to try and do it.
Does she have plans to emigrate?
No, but our daughter, who wants to spend a semester in Spain, wanted to do it, and my wife said, "Wait till after that semester. Be all American until then." Michael.
Can I go back a little bit to Islam? My understanding was in the beginning what Muhammad was proposing, this monotheism, was certainly upsetting to the polytheistic society there and the established powers that be. And that was a lot of the opposition to him. And Jews, or some Jews, in Arabia, sided with the established people and didn't support Muhammad originally, and that's why some of the animosity to Jews. Does that square with anything?
It does kind of square, but I'm not, I don't know who those Jews were. What we know, So if you read the Quran reads like a recapitulation of the stories in Torah. So Muhammad is living in Jerusalem, walking down the streets, hearing the stories told over and over again. He has his wilderness experience, travels from Mecca to Medina, remembers these stories and rewrites them into his sacred book, which was going to be the Quran. Islam is remarkably compatible with Judaism. And if you really look at Islam as a monotheism, it is almost a mirror of Judaism. Dietary laws, the understanding of the Sabbath, the whole idea of submission, of giving yourself to God. This is all very similar kind of teachings that Judaism has. It's very different than Christianity because Christianity has this external idea of messianism that's totally foreign to Judaism and Islam. Christianity has this idea of the Trinity, dividing the Godhead into parts, totally foreign to Judaism and Islam. And so, clearly there was much greater affinity. And when Judaism rejected that, it's not unforeseen that Islam would react, that Muhammad would react negatively to that rejection. And his target was, of course, Jerusalem, because even though Rome was there, Rome was a fading force by the 7th century. So we're up to 1492, 1500. We've made it through the Spanish expulsion. We have 2 more sessions. Yes, 2 more sessions. And our goal is to cover the last 600 years in in 2 weeks. And I think it's reasonable that we can do that, considering we covered almost 800 years tonight. What is interesting in the next set of the next period is the rise of Haskalah alongside the emergence of Hasidism. We'll talk about what those are. But Judaism again mutates after this expulsion and changes dramatically. And we'll see as we press on.
Go back to the beginning. You commented that when the Christians took Jerusalem, they put the Jews in the synagogue and burned it. You also commented that when Saladin took Jerusalem, he invited Jews back. When the Christians took Jerusalem, what did they do with the Muslims? Threw them out. And when Saladin took Jerusalem, what did he do with the Christians?
With the Christians?
Yeah. This is a three-way, this is a three-threaded,
A
three-threaded braid in 2 parts of the braid.
Sounds like who's on first.
Didn't Jews fight with the Muslims to defend Jerusalem during
Right.
6?
Right, so when Saladin goes against the Christians, Jews fought on the side of Saladin.
Right. Which doesn't say what Saladin did to the Christians.
Against the Christians. And to be honest, I don't know the
Okay.
answers to that
Okay.
question. When the Crusaders came through and drove the Muslims out of Jerusalem, as far as I can tell, most of the Muslims fled back to the Mediterranean coasts, to Spain and to Portugal, to Alexandria, towards Egypt. I don't know that the Christians put them all in mosque and burned them out.
Well, we do know that the world was pretty brutal,
Mhm.
and that even as recently, as World War II, before there was independent free press embedded in the war zone, so to speak, what was acceptable, around the world, was pretty wide open. So that you can only imagine that these were, brutal conflicts.
Seriously, brutal now. I mean, I think once the fighting gets going, it ramps up to challenge. I think that's just a human condition.
Thank you all. Kind of a different path tonight. Next week we will pick up in 1493 and move forward